My father Wallace was born inland here in this Northern Irish linen village of Upperlands, and neither of his parents was particularly a sailor, and yet for some reason he always yearned for the ocean, to master the waves. He began sailing here on the dams that were constructed around the linen mill in order to provide power and water for the linen process. So this very spot is where he would have begun his first very amateurish experiments in sailing, in a dinghy which his father bought him, and his poor sister Jill, who was a toddler, was involved in various rather hair-raising experiments in self-instruction in sailing. But of course, even as a child, Wallace sensed that sailing on the dam was rather tame compared with what he ultimately dreamed of doing. For some reason, he always had an absolute inner longing to be on the ocean, to be mastering the ocean wave. So in the late 40s, he settled down to a lifetime's work in the family linen business, and it was more and more important to him to get away at weekends and in every moment of free time to the ocean, to the Irish and Scottish coasts, and to have some liberation, if you like, from the fairly regimented sort of life that he was experiencing back here in Upperlands. So from the late 40s onwards, he was sailing the Irish and Scottish coasts in small wooden sailing boats, teaching himself how to sail the ocean, if you like, and he developed an enormous store of knowledge. He was really a pioneer of recreational sailing on the Irish coast. Wallace could strike up a friendship with anybody who shared his love of the sea and who shared his sense of the sea as a place to be loved and, in a sense, mastered, but also feared and respected. So an important stage in my father's self-instruction as a yachtsman was his first trip to Rathlin. And in his book about Rathlin, he describes very modestly how in his then very small boat, the Fugitive, a little 3-tonner, he sailed over from Ballycastle, I suppose, and just as they were entering the harbour, they came a cropper on a reef. It was rather embarrassing, and he really wasn't sure how long this small boat was going to survive this terrible thumping against the reef. And luckily, boatloads of islanders suddenly turned up and gave him some friendly help in getting away from the reef and getting into harbour. And they were obviously quite amused by the whole episode. They must have seen many a yachtsman get into trouble on this reef. My father used to tell the story of how on his first trip to Rathlin he came a cropper on the reef called the Bow, which was a bit embarrassing. And I suppose over time, he learnt these waters and he learnt how to avoid the various reefs and how to avoid the various tide rips. So you probably observed him becoming a more and more skilled seafarer.
Oh yes, I mean, if you look out at the rock armour there now, that was the reef.
Do you think that his writing might have played a part in getting a harbour for this place?
Well, he certainly made an awareness of Rathlin. He did play this part over it.
Now, in the days when he was an impulsive young bachelor, he used to change sailing boat quite often, but he had one particularly beloved boat in the early 50s. That was a 27-footer called Carew, and in Carew he made trips to Brittany, to Norway, around Ireland, so that was an important stage in his sailing career. And then finally, in 1956, he acquired the boat that would be really the love of his life in maritime terms, Wild Goose. Here's a famous photograph of the boat with two masts, the mizzen mast and the main mast. A huge wooden mast in those days, so you can see the boat as she was under Wallace Clark's ownership. So Wild Goose, from Wallace's point of view, began life as a vessel in which he simply had lots of fun and lots of time with his young family, splashing about in the waters of Ireland and Scotland, and then later on the French Riviera after his sail through the French canals. But later on, Wild Goose would have some extraordinary adventures because Wallace and his son Miles, it's my brother Miles, jointly accomplished an extraordinary historic voyage in Wild Goose, a circumnavigation of Europe. But I suppose, like any old boat, maybe she became tired, she became weary of all this voyaging after a while, this exotic voyaging, and on a fateful night in summer 1998, Wild Goose seemed to give up the ghost in a way. This was when Wallace was steering Wild Goose back into the mouth of the Bann on a dark, gusty night. And with a series of human errors that he freely admitted, he managed to run aground and then have to call on the aid of the lifeboat. And as a result of that rescue operation, Wild Goose unfortunately sank in about 30 feet.
I came across this message from Wallace, who informed me that Wild Goose sadly had been lost at the Bar Mouth, and that if there was an interest in the Maritime Heritage Group to take on the Wild Goose on the seabed, then we, between the insurance company and ourselves and the Royal Engineers, that we would do the salvage operation as a community project.
By the time she was salvaged, Wild Goose was already a venerable old boat of 62 years. But Wallace's other passion involved delving much further into the past and remaking some of the great voyages of history. Two of the great moments in his life, really, consisted of exercises in maritime reconstruction of voyages between Ireland and Scotland. And the first of those great projects of reconstruction was in 1963, when he oversaw the building and then skippered a curragh, very much of the kind that would have been used by the early Christian saints. And this was a voyage from Derry to Iona in memory of the voyage accomplished by St. Columba in the year 563. And I suppose the other big project of maritime reconstruction was in 1991, when he oversaw the building and then the sailing of a galley, a wooden galley, of the kind that would have plied the waters of Ireland and Scotland in medieval times. And this time the maiden voyage was from the west of Ireland, from Westport and Mayo to the Western Isles. In the medieval galley, known as the Ailech, he was really reconstructing the world of the Lordship of the Isles. That was a maritime kingdom that held sway on the west coast of Scotland in the Middle Ages, a sort of Gaelic Nordic kingdom founded in effect by the great seafaring warrior Somerled, whom my father greatly admired. And he was able to bring that world alive with a sort of public history lesson in that summer of 1991 when he sailed the Ailech from Ireland to Scotland. But I'm glad to say that that voyage in 1963 was not the last modern effort to reconstruct the world of the Apostle of Scotland. In fact, much more recently, the Causeway Coast Maritime Heritage Group built a curragh and carried out another reconstruction voyage to reproduce the historic voyage of the Irish-born Apostle of Scotland, which was made by tradition in 563. Can you tell us a bit about this boat?
Made it in 1987, in which they rated their first voyage up to Iona with only oars to sail and a steering oar as well. So that was the first voyage she done, was the remake of St. Columba or St. Columba Kills up to Iona. Yeah.
But you allow yourselves a few modern aids, probably, that St. Columba wouldn't have had.
Yeah, if we get into trouble, we have to have a backup, especially when sometimes we don't have a support vessel. So we have what we like to call the Iron Monk to pull us out of trouble if we have difficulties next to shore. But generally we try to do everything as natural as possible with oars and sail.
And that vessel, the Columkill, is still plying the Irish and Scottish waters, and in that sense the tradition of Wallace Clark and the revival of the Columba legacy is still very much a work in progress. I said that Rathlin was a very, very important stepping stone for Wallace. It was the first island that he sailed to. It was where he received a few lessons in sailing. It was the subject of his first full-length book on maritime history. So Rathlin always had a very special place in his heart. And it seems entirely appropriate that a book about his sailing adventures over 60 years was launched on Rathlin Island by publishers who have their base on Rathlin Island, Rathlin Island Books. Wallace was fascinated by all the links between the north coast of Ireland and the west coast of Scotland. Strategic connections, human connections, commercial connections, and above all, Christian and spiritual connections. And those spiritual connections also mean a lot to Robin Ruddock, who's the new owner and steward of Wild Goose.
And the significance of the Wild Goose for me is in her name as well, not just the fact that she's a historic vessel in her own right, but that's the symbol of the Holy Spirit in the early Christian Celtic Church. So it's really nice to have a vessel come into your responsibility, and it is just I do see this as being, I'm the custodian. Wallace was a custodian for many years in his family, and the boat has moved on now through the Causeway Coast Maritime Heritage Group into our family, and we'll certainly do our best to maintain and improve and look after her.
So on a summer's day, when the newly published book Call of the Running Tide is doing some brisk business, and when the Curragh, the Columkill, is sailing out of Rathlin Harbour, I think we can say that the spirit of Wallace Clark is very much alive and living in Rathlin and many other places too.